Next, I would like to call upon Professor Daniel Raveh, sir, for his presentation.
Okay, so good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to speak here again. Yesterday I said something on Ramchandra Gandhi. Today I will speak on K.C.Bhattacharya. I was hoping that my paper can be screened because I'm going to quote from K.C.Bhattacharya. It would be easier to follow. To thank my friend Professor Anand Mishra, and I'm very honored to meet Professor D.K. Mohanta, who is a much greater expert than me on the writings of K.C.Bhattacharya. So I will start, and let's see if the text can appear before you all of a sudden. So I wrote a paper which I titled K.C.Bhattacharya, Not Only an Advaita Thinker. It has two sections. The first section is on Advaita. The second section is on Sankhya philosophy. I will only have time to read before you the first section, which suits the seminar, Advaita Vedanta. So the first section is titled Writing in English, Thinking Through Sanskrit Terms. Immanuel Levinas, not there yet, Immanuel Levinas constructed his theory of responsibility thinking through Hebrew words. Yeah, no, but now it has to cancel me and put the text on full screen. Opposite. Yeah, we want the text. Yes, a little bigger even if possible. Can you make it a little bigger? Yes, okay. So, and someone will roll down as I speak. Yes, thank you so much. So again, I'm saying that Immanuel Levinas constructed his theory of responsibility thinking through the Hebrew words achrayut, responsibility, and acher, other. The former, achrayut, is derived from the latter, in the same way that responsibility in English is a matter of response to the other. The other faces me, Levinas writes, and puts me in question and obliges me. The face presents itself and demands, this sounds as if K.C.Bhattacharya wrote it, demands justice. This is from Totality and Infinity. In this case, etymology and ethics coincide. David Patterson explains that, I'm quoting, Hebrew was the first language that Levinas could read and write, with Hebrew as not only the language of his study, but as the first language of his literacy. It is not surprising to find that the Holy Tongue influenced the nature of Levinas's thinking. KCB, I will refer to Krishnachandra Bhattacharya as KCB. KCB's Sanskrit background is highlighted by Gopinath Bhattacharya, his son and editor of his collected writings. In his introduction to KCB's collected writings, he studied Sanskrit, Gopinath tells us, from his grandfather, a Sanskrit scholar, I'm quoting Gopinath, trained in the indigenous seminaries of learning. It is therefore, apropos Patterson, not surprising to find that the Holy Tongue, in this case Sanskrit, influenced the nature of KCB's thinking. The place of Sanskrit in KCB's thinking and his sentiment towards classical Sanskrit sources find expression in Swarajin ideas. His famous lecture turned into essay from 1928 or 1929. So his sentiment towards Sanskrit finds expression in Swarajin ideas through the concept of the indigenous. I'm quoting, it is admitted today, KCB claims, what was not sufficiently recognized in the earlier days of our Western education, that we had an indigenous culture of high degree of development, the comparative value of which cannot be said to have been yet sufficiently appraised. Many of our educated men do not know and do not care to know this indigenous nature of ours. When they seek to know, they do not feel as they ought to feel that they are discovering their own self. The concept of the indigenous as used by KCB hints at the tradition texts that he imbibed at home and studied at the Presidency College, Calcutta. KCB continues to comment on the English or European education that he and many others, quote unquote, our educated men, have received, that, I'm quoting again, all concepts and ideas, even in the sciences, he stresses, have the distinctive character of the particular culture to which they belong. What would be our reaction to such cultural ideas? KCB asks his listeners at the Hooghly College. And in reply, he suggests that, again I'm quoting, they have to be, yeah, it is before you, they have to be accepted, but metaphors and symbols to be translated into our own indigenous concepts. The ideas embodied in a foreign language are properly understood only when we can express them in our own way. I plead for a genuine translation of foreign ideas into our native ideas before we accept or reject them. Let us everywhere resolutely think in our own concepts. It is only thus that we can think productively on our own account. KCB's plea for translation from European or colonial terms into Indian or indigenous terms further echoes in A. Raghuram Raju's notion of calibrating Western philosophy for India. Calibrating Western Philosophy for India, which is also the title of his 2019 book. In a nutshell, Raghuram Raju suggests that modern India is a mix of both the classical and the modern. Therefore, classical Indian theory, such as the political theory found in Kautilya's Arthashastra, and Western theory, such as Marxism, are not sufficient if one aims to theorize the current Indian situation. This is the reason that Raghuram Raju thinks of the possibility of calibrating or bending, as he puts it, Western philosophy for India. At times, he explains, modern Indian philosophy leaned too much towards the West and neglected its roots. And on the other hand, those who chose to focus on Indian texts from the past found themselves isolated and risked being considered outdated. Therefore, Raghuram Raju aims to find another way, a middle way. But what about calibrating Indian philosophy for the West? He was asked when he visited Tel Aviv a few years ago. No, he answered. Actually, he was like, no. The post-colonial situation is one-sided. It is India which is in search of identity despite language, education, and philosophy imposed on it by the British colonizer. KCB explains in Swarajian Ideas that his plea to resolutely think in our own concepts, in indigenous concepts, is a matter of finding the right distance from Western philosophy, with its inbuilt foreignness and colonial fingerprints, distance that would enable him and others to assess Western ideas before accepting or rejecting them. But what about the distance needed for those rooted in classical Indian philosophy, from their own tradition and roots, in order to assess or reassess the ideas voiced in the tradition texts? The shackles of one's own tradition, Rajendra Prasad argues in reply to KCB, in his contribution to the special issue of the Indian Philosophical Quarterly on KCB's Swarajian Ideas from 1984, are as tight and constraining, often tighter and more constraining than the colonial otherness inscribed in Western philosophy. Any tradition, Prasad asserts, can dominate an individual, and even an indigenous one can dominate him to the extent of destroying or very greatly weakening his judgmental decision-making ability, his ability to think freely, objectively, and dispassionately. If such a thing happens, it will not be less than annihilation, or at least suppression, of Swaraj in ideas. Prasad is hardly fascinated by the idea of the indigenous, even if KCB's concept of the indigenous is not pristine and acknowledges or even invites, quote-unquote, assimilations. Prasad further argues that the indigenous traditions Bhattacharya wants us to revere are our ancient traditions, but the classical Hindu traditions do not constitute a homogeneous mass, and a reverential attitude is no guarantee that the traditions one reveres are all desirable. His conclusion is that, again I'm quoting, the chances of an indigenous tradition dominating one's thought and action patterns in a much more gripping manner, therefore, would be greater than those of an alien tradition. K.C. Bhattacharya's answer, if I may extract an answer from Swarajian ideas, would be that a pathological reversal has occurred, owing to which classical Indian philosophy feels foreign to the contemporary Indian intellectual, whereas she or he feels at home in Western philosophy. Prasad and Raghuram Raju are critical of any attempt to fall back on the past in the name of the present and the future. Prasad suggests that to replace modernism with traditionalism and reverentialism is a grave mistake. Raghuram Raju agrees with him that the real clash is not between India and the West, but between the modern and the pre-modern or the classical. Prasad, sharp as ever, drives his point home. In a country open to the influence of an alien culture, he writes, one's subjugation to his own traditions may be treated by some as a safeguard against his possible subjugation by the former. One may feel tempted, like KCB I'm adding, to believe that it will not let him be resubjugated by the alien cultures. This may be true, Prasad writes, but it is like the belief that a dead man cannot re-die. But it is not to be forgotten that the dead man certainly can stink. Resort to the tradition, to indigeneity as a remedy to westernization, Prasad sees as a morbid act. His bottom line reminds me of Vyas, the Yoga Sutra commentator, who suggests in his commentary to Sutra 215 that whoever thinks that the remedy for dukkha, suffering or evil, as KCB renders this fundamental term, evil is sukha anubhava, the experience of pleasure. Whoever thinks that the remedy for dukkha is sukha is all wrong. This is Vyas. Committing this mistake, Vyas suggests, is like running away from the sting of a scorpion just to get bitten by a snake. A metaphor that works also for Prasad's critique of running away from colonialism to the bear hug of traditionalism. KCB's rendering of dukkha as evil, in Pain as Evil, chapter 1 of his studies in Sankhya philosophy, is an example of a counter-translation, not from European philosophy to our native ideas, but of an essential Sanskrit notion into Western terms and a Western discourse with its Judeo-Christian theological overtones. KCB's translation choice, evil, not as usual suffering, invites further reflection. My contention is that since colonialism is evil, and since the antonym of evil according to KCB, as he clarifies in the final sentence of his chapter, is not the good, but freedom, and since freedom for him is not just a metaphysical ideal, as in classical Sankhya, but also a political goal, I mean the independence that he's dreaming of, but also a political goal, then if we read KCB's studies in Sankhya philosophy vis-a-vis Swarajian ideas, it would not be far-fetched to suggest that KCB, the translator, adds political overtones to classical Sankhya. By the way, Swarajian ideas is not included in the collected writings of K.C. Bhattacharya. I assume that his son and editor wanted to separate quote-unquote politics from quote-unquote hardcore philosophy, but I'm not sure that this is possible. Can we really do it? Is philosophy really a quote-unquote pure realm, not to be tarnished by politics? I mean, politics of ideas. This is what KCB is discussing, the politics of ideas. I'm writing K.C.B. brings a classical discourse, the Sankhya discourse. The Sankhya Karika, it is actually his Bhashya to Sankhya Karika verse 1. So he brings a classical discourse down to earth, revealing its subtle political relevance. In this case, if this is the case, then Kaivalya, the Sankhyan concept of freedom, can be rendered as independence, and more literally as referring to apartness and separation from the British rule, both external and internal. Colonialism operates from outside in, from political oppression to the occupation. Macaulay and K.C.B. from both sides of the colonial border would agree of mind and soul. Freedom, on the other hand, from Sankhya philosophy to K.C.B.'s Swarajin ideas, emanates from inside out. The final concept which I wish to examine here today, probably I already crossed 15 minutes. The final concept that I wish to examine here today under the rubric of writing in English thinking through Sanskrit terms is K.C.B.'s Maha concept of the subject. My contention is that his concept of the subject is a melting pot of the Upanishadic Shankarite Atman with Kant and Hegel. As in the case of dukkha as evil, K.C.B. interweaves a pivotal Sanskrit notion with an essential European concept. For the Indian roots of K.C.B.'s concept of the subject, take for instance the following paragraph. Paragraph 4, the notion of subjectivity of chapter 1 of the subject is freedom. So let's read together and I'll say a few words on this paragraph and I'll close. Object, I'm quoting, as symbolized by the word this, may be an individual object or a generality. The word I, as intending the subject, is not definitely either singular or general. It is indeed used to indicate not only one thing at a time, but a thing which cannot be indicated by more than one speaker. But then different speakers can be understood to use it. Each of a distinct thing, namely himself, by the same hearer, and understood to use as he would use it. As used, the term has a uniquely singular reference, but as understood, it is general in the sense that the term unique is general. This is a wonderful sentence. But as understood, it is general in the sense that the term unique is general. Shankara's Adhyasa Bhashya, that was mentioned here several times, echoes in this paragraph. Shankara's concepts of Vishaya and Vishayi, the object and the subject, the former manifested in the idea of you, the latter in the idea of I, and the discontent for the subject involved in their natural, naisargika, but erroneous intermixture, Adhyasa, are at the core of K.C.B.'s paragraph. The idea of a pure subject above and beyond everything objective, the Shadic concept of but K.C.B. does not just recap a long tradition of Indian thinking about the idea of an objectless subject. A master of words, general overtones of the word unique. He makes a distinction between use, singular, general, but nevertheless there is a sense of misnomership in the generality of the word unique. It feels counterintuitive meaning. This counterintuitiveness also applies to the concept of subjectivity in K.C.B.'s projects life into the old concept of the Atman. The linguistic illustration that K.C.B. comes up with, the term unique in general, gives a glimpse into the intricacy of the experience of subjectivity. The general above and beyond stands on the shoulders of my singular embodied experience here and now. If the singular meaning of the word unique cannot be disposed of, even when we speak of the term in general, how does it project on the place of singularity in the everything but singular Advaitic experience of the Atman? This is yet another articulation of a pertinent point developed by K.C.B. in his essay Shankara's Doctrine of Maya, which he has read in the first meeting of the Indian Philosophical Congress in 1925. In this essay, this is my last paragraph, don't worry. In this essay, K.C.B. focuses on what he refers to as the third stage of the snake. In the previous two stages, discussed time and again, I mean, you know the parable about the Raju and the Sarpa, the rope and the snake. In the previous two stages, discussed time and again, both traditionally and contemporarily, the snake is perceived first as real, then as unreal. Namely, first as a snake and then as a rope. But what happens next? For Shankara, see Brahma Sutra Bhashya 146, there is no next. When you realize that the snake is in fact a rope, this is the moment of spiritual awakening. Both anxiety and conceptual error come to their mutual end. But according to K.C.B., though corrected, the snake is not forgotten. Like the individual self, the snake that was not really there at any point of time is still, I'm quoting him, felt to be given, responded to, and even perceived in absolute mockery of thought, even after its correction. As an Advaita commentator, and I think that what I'm saying here connects to my previous talks in this department about newness and philosophy, newness in philosophy. As an Advaita commentator, K.C.B. uses the third stage of the snake, in which it neither exists nor do not exist, to rethink Shankara's notion of Maya. But the point that I wish to make here is that the third stage of the snake also enables K.C.B. to touch on what he sees as the crux of the matter. Namely, I'm quoting him for the last time, the hidden subjective defect through which the snake is still given, unquote. A philosopher through and through, K.C.B. is interested in the mechanism of the human gaze, in the materials which constitute the gaze, and in borderline situations in which we do not see what we are, quote unquote, supposed to see, and do not feel or experience what we are, again, quote unquote, supposed to feel. Thanks.